Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us for this first Italian research seminar of the spring semester 2023. My name is Charles Levitt. I'm the Associate Director of the Center for Italian Studies, and I'm very happy to welcome you here to this lecture by Rino Modronuti, which is co-sponsored by the Department of Classics and the Medieval Institute. So I want to thank our co-sponsors in addition to the Center for Italian Studies. So the Italian Research Seminar is a core event of the Center's annual academic year. It aims to provide a regular forum for faculty, postdoctoral scholars, graduate students, and colleagues from other universities to present and discuss their current research. And our speaker today is, I think, both a part of our community here of Italian Studies at Notre Dame and representative of another university, because Rino Modronuti is Associate Professor of Medieval Latin Literature at the University of Padua, where he previously held the position of Visiting Professor of Medieval and Humanistic Philology. His main research interests lie in medieval historiography and encyclopedism, and in the tradition of classical Latin literature in the late Middle Ages and in Italian Humanism. He's published several critical editions of Albertino Mussato's works and the monograph Fra Giovanni Colonna e la Storia Antica da Adriano ai Severi from 2013, as well as a number of edited volumes on late medieval culture. And so please join me in welcoming our first speaker this academic year, this spring semester, Rino Modronuti.
Thank you, Charles, and thank you to the Center of Italian Studies for inviting me, and to the Medieval Institute at the Department of Classics which co-sponsors this seminar. So the title, you can see the title of my lecture there, and I will start. This evening I will present some results of an ongoing research on early 15th century humanism in the Veneto region, with particular attention to its relationships with the previous so-called pre-humanistic generations, from Albertino Mussato up to Petrarch. The primary focus of the project is the work of the Paduan notary, chancellor and humanist Sico Polenton. He wrote the Scriptorum Illustrium Latine Lingue Libri Decem et Octo, the 18 books about the great Latin writers. Some of the results of this research have already been published in one of the sections of the volume L'Umanesimo di Sico Polenton, the blue one in the middle, Sico Polenton's Humanism, and in the book Sico Polenton Vite dei Moderni, Lives of the Modern Authors, Albertino Mussato, Dante, Petrarca, Boccaccio, co-edited by Professor Laura Banella and me. More extensive results, I hope, will be published into different anthologies of the Scriptores Illustres to be published in the next couple of years, one in the Bloomsbury Neo-Latin series and the second in the series Per Verba, Testi Medio-Latini Umanistici con Traduzione of the Sismel. And here on my right and your left there's the first page of the autograph manuscript of the Scriptores Illustres. As it is well known, between the end of the 13th century and the first 3 decades of the 14th century, Padua, an independent and prosperous republican city-state, was one of the most advanced cultural and literary centers of the Italian peninsula. It has been considered the possible cradle of Italian humanism. The most prominent figure of this proto-humanistic movement was Albertino Mussato. Deeply involved in the political life of his city, in its highest ranks, Albertino animated a complex and articulated cultural and literary project, revitalizing some pivotal classical literary genres such as the Senecan tragedy and Livian historiography, and recodifying other ones such as the philosophical dialogue. He and his Paduan humanist fellows such as Rolando da Piazzolla reaped the seeds planted by their master and intellectual father, Lovato Lovati, highly praised by Petrarch in his Rerum Memorandarum Libri for his poetry. In the second half of the 14th century, Padua, a republic no more, but a city-state ruled by a signore, the Carrara family, hosted Petrarch during the last years of his life, a fact that deeply influenced the culture of the city. The continuity between Albertino's cultural achievements and the presence of Petrarch is clearly demonstrated by the strong and essential connection between the poetic coronation of Mussato in 1315 and Petrarch's coronation in Rome in 1340. It has been proved that Petrarch constructed his coronation ceremony building on the celebration and symbols used for Mussato's coronation, and indeed it was Mussato who laid the foundation of the modern myth of ancient poetic coronations. I want to point out that this idea of Padua as the cradle of Italian humanism, due to the presence of Albertino Mussato and Petrarch, is neither a modern nor contemporary critical framework. As my mentor Giovanna Gianola recently suggested, it was Sico Polentone in the first half of the 15th century who invented the category of prehumanism a few years after Petrarch's death, although without using the word prehumanism. As it is well known, in the early Quattrocento, the main center of Italian humanism was Florence, although Venice had an important role. Losing its independence in 1406, Padua lost part of its cultural preeminence, although the university still maintained a pivotal cultural function. From a humanistic point of view, at the very beginning of the 15th century, Gasparino Barzizza taught for several years at the Studio, and other important humanists, such as Piero Vergerio di Elder and Vittorino da Feltre, studied and worked in Padua. One of the most important figures of Paduan humanism in the first decades of the 15th century was indeed Sico Polentone, who was active continuously for almost 4 decades. The first part of this talk will be dedicated to Sico and to his major work, the first history of Latin literature, De Scriptoris Illustres, and the second part of the talk will focus on the minor yet fascinating figure in Sico's cultural circle, Antonio Baratella, who will help us to better understand this crucial moment in the history of humanism. Sico Polentone was born in 1376, and he spent his whole life in Padua, where he was a notary and then one of the chancellors of the Comune, started his second office the year before the conquest of the city by Venice in 1405. From a sociological point of view, his life should have been quite similar to the lives of the erudite notaries of the Italian golden age of the Comuni between the late 13th and the 14th century, such as Mussato himself. However, there was an important difference, such as the involvement in the political life of the city. Mussato was one of the leaders of the Paduan Communal Republic. Instead, Sico worked as officer of an administration controlled first by a signore, in Padua the Carrara family, then by a foreign state, that is the Republic of Venice. Sico's first known work are the Argumenta super aliquot orationibus et invectivis Ciceronis, summaries of some of Cicero's oration and invectives, composed in 1413 as a continuation of Antonio Loschi's Inquisitio super undecim orationibus Ciceronis, research on 11 of Cicero's speeches. The Argumenta show a deeper interest for history than for rhetoric, since Sico does not dedicate a lot of space to rhetorical issues as Antonio Loschi did. Instead, in his work, he focuses on the political and historical context of Cicero's speeches. This historical attitude and this attention to the historical context is to be found also in the Scriptoris Illustres. Sico Magnus Opus are indeed the Scriptorum Illustrium Latinae Lingue Libri XVIII, and he started to compose it in 1419 and continued at least until 1433. and the work is not finished, also in the final version that we have in the autograph manuscript that you see at the very beginning of the PowerPoint. In 1419, he also composed the Catinia, a playful dialogue where the characters praise wine and food and enjoy life, but also criticize mildly the university environment and its scholastic approach. Sico decided to write the lives, this is some lines from the poem of the Scriptores. Sico decided to write the lives of the most illustrious writers of the past, since their lives combine two questions that he and his culture deemed as fundamental: the moral example of their actions and their role as rhetorical authorities. The moral aspect of writers' lives is crucial for Sico, who is instead not particularly interested in philological issues. Ancient writers lived ethically and wrote splendidly, and Sico recognized that his own writing could not be an example of well-refined Latin style, but his history of Latin literature suggests to its readers some models, first of all Cicero, to whom Sico dedicated 7 of the 18 books of the work. At the second place we find Seneca, to whom 1 book is dedicated, a perfect example of both moral life and refined prose. Although a different kind of prose, obviously. There's huge stylistic differences between Cicero and Seneca's prose, but Sico liked them both very much. A good example of the strong influence of the long-term Paduan humanistic pillars in Sico's own vision and understanding of ancient culture and literature is the primary role of Livy, both inside and outside the Scriptores Illustres. One of the main reasons of the Paduan obsession towards Livy is that the Roman historian was born and died in Padua, as Jerome's Chronicon testifies. In the Scriptores Illustres, Sico recollected almost all the surviving data about Livy's life that could be found in ancient authors, from Martial to Quintilian and from Seneca to Pliny. As he usually did with ancient authors, Sico inserted Livy's life in his cultural and historical environment, and he provided a vivid, although sometimes pretentious, image of his monumental work, the Abu Recondita Libri, which he knew quite well. At the end of Livy's biography, Sico quoted and discussed Livy's supposed burial inscription, which was discovered in Padua in the second decade of the 14th century during the ongoing renovations of the Basilica of Santa Giustina, whose abbot at the time was Mussato's brother, Gualbertino. The Paduan proto-humanists gave great value to the epigraph that was set into a wall in Santa Giustina's cloister. Rolando da Piazzolla was probably the author of a Life of Livy, which included the inscription. This introduction to the inscription is the final part of this Rolando da Piazzolla Life of Livy, which is called Titus Livius Auctor, because the first words of the life are this one. The Paduan proto-humanistic, a few decades later, Petrarch wrote his letter to Livy, pretending to be sitting in front of the same epigraph. And as it is well known, it is with Petrarch that we can trace a deep philological interest in the structure and in the tradition of Livy's work. His philological conclusions were rigorously reported by Sico in the Scriptores Illustres. But Sico offered to his fellow humanists and to us something more. In 1413, ancient human remains were found near the Basilica of Santa Giustina, in the exact same place where 100 years before Livy's epitaph emerged. The Paduan intellectuals, first of all Sicco himself, had no doubt they must have been Livy's bones. And Sicco could finally put together Livy's physical remains and his spiritual self, that is Livy's work, Livy's Aburbe Condita Libri. And the great Roman historian solemnly walked to the streets of Padua, from Santa Giustina to the Palazzo della Ragione, walked to the streets of Padua and found his place, his final rest place, in the political and symbolic center of the city, the Palazzo della Ragione, where the bones were buried and where they stayed until the late 19th century. In his letter to Livy, Petrarch wrote, "I would like to live in your age, or that you lived in mine. For one day, that is what symbolically happened in Padua in 1413. Livy actually walked among his fellow citizens." Sicco designed a majestic memorial to be located in the Piazza dei Signori, too, one of the most important places in Padua, perhaps more important than the two places that you can see in these two pictures. But the monument was not was never realized. To us, this may look like a naive and odd scene, all these humanists and professors of the university walking with these bones through the city in a very solemn attitude. But for the Paduans and for all the humanists of the 15th century, it was not. That is clearly proved by the fact that the news of this Paduan discovery spread widely and attracted vivid interest by some of the most relevant Italian humanists. Sicco wrote to Niccolò Niccoli about Livy's bones, and he was asked by Leonardo Bruni to provide him with further details about their anatomy. The issue was discussed among the professors of the university and even at the presence of the Pope, and it's Bruni that testifies this latter fact. In a work, as the Scriptores Illustres, focused on the ancient Latin authors, medieval times play a really small part, but the role of a few modern authors, that is Mussato, Dante, Petrarca and Boccaccio, can help to clarify Sicco's and his fellow Paduan humanists' idea of literature and literary authority. It's important to underline that modern authors are not those contemporary to Sicco, who are explicitly excluded from the Scriptores Illustres and only mentioned sometimes as sources for the information. Firstly, as Professor Banella pointed out, in the second and last version of the Scriptores, Sicco argued that it was Dante, the author, who actually started the process to reawaken the Muses, who had been sleeping for almost 1,000 years from the ancient antiquity, from the death of Juvenale. That is highly significant, especially in a Paduan context where, as we already said, there was a strong self-awareness of the city's own cultural humanistic heritage. And the point is that in the first version, the Muses started this process of waking up with Mussato, with a Paduan author. And in the second one, in the second version, the one who reawaked the Muses was Dante. Sicco did not mention Dante's Eglogs, his only Latin poetic work, and he focused his praise of Dante on the vernacular Commedia. Dante is the poet-theologian, extremely intelligent and erudite, in what seems to be a brief rewriting of Niccoli's praise of Dante in the second book of Bruni's Dialogi ad Petrum Paulum Istrum, which Sicco knew and used as a point of reference. Dante was both a man of natural intelligence and educated in the liberal arts. He dedicated himself to the most noble disciplines. He was a deeply learned man with both modern and ancient knowledge. Dante's biography epitomizes the qualities that are needed to be included among the scriptores illustres. The writing style must be excellent, exquisitus, but it is far more important that the works themselves are valuable for the knowledge they deliver. While the authors must be role models. They are moral models, but they must be models of intelligence and of diligence in studying as well. Indeed, Dante wrote such a valuable work, the Commedia, that even it is in the vernacular, it granted him a space among the most illustrious writers. Latine Lingue, Scriptorum Illustrum Latine Lingue is the title of the work. In Petrarch's profile, all of those qualities already hinted at in Dante's biography, and that Sico highlights in Mussato's biography too, are fully developed. In the Scriptores, Mussato's life is indeed a sort of exact parallel of Dante's one, which is quite odd, considering that the two main poets of the early 14th century, Dante and Mussato, were not exactly the dearest friends, and they stubbornly ignored each other for all their lives and in all their works, and they lived in the exact same years. Dante died a few years before Mussato, but they lived exactly the same years, and they share the same historical and cultural context. In the Scriptores, Petrarch is the true modern intellectual. He is not comparable to Virgil or Cicero, but he is the one who has been able to write exquisitely in different genres and to start a cultural renaissance after studies, eloquence and poetry have been neglected for 1,000 years. Petrarch's biography is far the longest among those of the four modern authors, and it closes the section dedicated to poetry, not just for chronological reasons, it seems, but also for such preeminence. Petrarch embodies the new, well-rounded, modern humanist intellectual, even though, in the historical progression of the Scriptores Illustres, after 1,000 years of sleep, as we saw a few minutes ago, the Muses woke up with Dante's vernacular poetry, as we saw. There is no modern author among the oratores, the most relevant group of authors considered in the Scriptores Illustres, nor any modern author can be compared to the Scriptores' two major authors, Seneca and Cicero. Although in Sico Scriptores poetry is not the most important writing genre, it is the only one in which modernity, especially with Petrarch, has truly paralleled antiquity, and thus the only one in which it enters with comparable honor and considerable space in what has been called the first history of Latin literature. All this considered, the Muses woke up with vernacular poetry. Therefore, it is the moral, doctrinal and sapiential value of poetry that in the case of Dante even transcends language, that allows modern authors to be on equal terms with the classics. I will now focus on a minor figure of Sico's cultural environment, the poet and teacher Antonio Baratella, in order to verify what we observed in Sico's work from a wider perspective. A slightly wider perspective. Baratella was born in Loreggia, a village near Padua, around 1385. He was forced by his father to study law, and he worked as a notary. However, after a few years, he decided that Apollo wanted something more for him. He abandoned his profession, and for the rest of his life he tried to find a patron who could finance him, while he composed thousands and thousands of repetitive and boring verses to the same addressees about the same topics. He himself kept an obsessive record of the number of verses he had wrote so far, and the total amounts to 72,000. He did not succeed in finding a patron, and therefore he was forced to be a teacher in different cities: Padua, Venice, Pirano in Istria, Belluno, Feltre. Sicco and his brother Francesco Polenton were two of his favorite addressees, and during the course of almost 30 years they received several poems by Antonio. I feel obliged to report that in more than one poem to Francesco Polenton, Sicco's brother, several times Baratella politely asked Francesco why his brother Sicco didn't answer to some of his metric letters, which consisted indeed mostly of praising platitudes. Here you have a poem addressed to Sicco by Antonio from a work called Antonia, composed between 1427 and 1429, on the old and common theme of the criticism by the envious. I would like you to focus on the fact that in the third decade of the 15th century, Baratella considered Petrarch a really great author, more relevant than other contemporary humanists, such as Gasparino Barzizza, Baratella himself, yes, he says that, and Sicco. In fact, is noteworthy and not to be taken for granted, since Barzizza, Baratella and Sicco should be considered proper humanists. They had received a complete and true humanistic education following the contemporary canon, while Petrarch's work were criticized and in particular were not deemed linguistically refined. Furthermore, from these lines, we can argue that Baratella thought that Sicco would have shared his opinion, and we know that Sicco actually would have substantially agreed with this judgment. In another earlier collection of poems by Baratella, the Ecatometrologia, we can read a poem that actually responded directly to the first part of Bruni's Dialogi ad Petrum Paulum Istrum, where Niccoli criticized both Dante and Petrarch quite harshly. This is the first version of the Ecatometrologia, which Baratella composed presumably around 1420 by putting together poems written to different addressees between 1405 and 1420. It is preserved in the manuscript Canonici Classici Latini 115 of the Bodleian Library in Oxford, and the second version of this work was composed around 1440. The work, the Ecatometrologia Oxoniensis, is divided into 3 books, and it is structured as a collection of examples of poems composed in a variety of classical or pretended classical meters and strophes, some of them invented by Baratella himself. The following poem is part of Book 3 and alternates an hexameter and a verse slightly similar, in Baratella's intention, to a iambelegus, which is a iambic dimeter plus the first part of a pentameter. But as Sabadini suggested, Baratella had only a very superficial and mechanical idea of non-hexametric versification, so that most of his iambic and trochaic lines do not respect the actual rules of ancient poetry. The poem is addressed to the Florentine humanist Leonardo Bruni, and it was probably written not long after the composition of Bruni's Dialogi in 1406. As you can see, Baratella involves all the 3 crowns of Italian literature in his response to his reading of Bruni's Dialogi. He first mentions Dante, referring to the Commedia, collocati le animas meritis modulamine divo. The second one, the alter, who is evoked, is Boccaccio, alter vaganti profuit pindica saxa frequentas. And it is quite interesting that Baratella refers only to a minor work by Boccaccio, the De Montibus, clearly identified for what it actually is, which is a treatise about poetic geography. But we have to keep in mind, that the Genealogia and the De Montibus by Boccaccio had an enormous success and circulation at every stage of Italian humanism and during the whole Renaissance. Moreover, Baratella probably didn't know the Bucolicum Carmen, the main Latin poetic work by Boccaccio, as it is suggested by Boccaccio's life in Siccos Scriptores, where the Bucolicum Carmen is not mentioned. However, the major part of Baratella's answer to Bruni is focused on Petrarch, the only poet laureate, author of a proper classical epic poem, De Africa, telling the epic deeds of Scipio the African. Talking about the poetic coronation, it is quite odd that the Paduan Baratella seems completely oblivious of Mussato's coronation, which was quite common knowledge in early 15th century Padua, and it is obviously mentioned in Siccos Scriptores. Furthermore, Baratella implicitly identifies Boccaccio as a vatis, an inspired poet, by referring to a prose erudite work about geographic names in ancient poetry. The canon fixed by Bruni in the Dialogi, the three Florentine crowns, Dante, Petrarch, Boccaccio, clearly dominates the intellectual debate in these years, so that Boccaccio must be included in a proper answer to Bruni's work, and Mussato has no place in it. I argue that the immediate relevance of Bruni's canon, as it is developed in the Dialogi, could also explain why Boccaccio, who is not mentioned in the first version of Siccos Scriptores, was indeed included in the second one, but not among the poets, but within the historians. Sicco is more accurate in his reconstruction of the cultural context of the previous generation. As for the arguments used by Baratella in order to defend Dante, Boccaccio, and mostly Petrarch, they are not well developed, as it is always the case in Baratella's poetry. But they can be summarized as the arguments in defense of poetry already developed by Mussato a century before, fully elaborated by Boccaccio in the Genealogia, and transposed by Sicco in the Scriptores a few years later. The literary excellency and sapiential subjects of the poetry, which qualify them as vates, a fact confirmed for Petrarch by the actual coronation. The progress of time and of humanistic values, so to say, cannot change the enduring achievements of the poetry by these three crowns. I argue that Baratella, as Sicco would do in the Scriptores, is not simply defending old literary authorities and values from a marginal conservative perspective, the Paduan perspective. He is saying that without the role of these precursors, humanism could not have been established itself, and therefore their merits cannot be underestimated, even in a more refined age as the one when Sicco and Baratella lived. This is exactly Sicco's own conclusion about Petrarch. I will conclude with a brief example concerning the ways in which the three crowns, and namely Dante, were used and quoted by Baratella. Among the 25 poetic works composed by Antonio, there are some predictable and flat heroic poems. Nevertheless, as we have seen with the previous two short poems, these are relevant as regards their content and the interpretation of contemporary culture that they convey. In 1439, while he was living quite miserably in Feltre, as a grammar teacher, Baratella composed the Polidores, dedicated to Guarino Veronese and inspired by the Astyanax by Maffeo Veggio. The Polidores is still unpublished, and it narrates in 3 books the unfortunate destiny of Polydorus of Troy, the youngest son of Priam. The first book is dedicated to the controversy between Juno and Venus on the final destiny of Troy. Juno descends to hell in order to find help for the destruction of the city of Troy. There she speaks with the Boccaccian Demogorgon, the chthonic dark ancestors of all pagan gods. The Demogorgon is quoted several times by Baratella in his poems, not only in the Polidores, offering further testimony to the immediate success of the character, who is at the very foundation of Boccaccio's Genealogia, a work that popularized this mythical figure. The second book of the Polidores narrates the sad story and the death of Polydorus, and in the third one Baratella focused on the revenge of Hecuba, Polydorus' mother. Avarizia, avidity, guides Polymestor, Polydorus' murderer, in a journey to the afterworld, where he can contemplate the punishments of the sinners until Polymestor's final judgment and conviction, which conclude, finally, the work. Although Baratella's image of the afterworld is deeply and mostly influenced by Virgil, Dante plays an important role in its construction. After descending in the underworld, Avarizia and Polymestor do not run into the souls of the non-buried, as in the Aeneid. Instead, they arrive to the limbo, described with some similarities with the Dantean limbo, as the place where the ones who did not fully believe in the true God are confined. As you know, in Inferno 4, Dante asks to Virgil if anyone has ever left the limbo, and Virgil remembers the possente consegno di Vittoria Cornato, a powerful one, crowned with a sign of victory, Christ, who immediately after Virgil's death came to save Adam, Abraham, Rachel, the 3 names that you find also here, and the other prophets. Baratella's poem is set before Jesus was born, therefore the harrowing of hell hadn't happened yet, and Polymestor can still find in the limbo the prima propago, Dante, and the other prophets, who indeed have faith in a way out, as he says, tot procere solim resonans sic fata magister, ad superos celestis auget sua gesta sibile, gens vera canet, quem Iesu mundus adoret. Furthermore, describing the nobile castello of the limbo, Dante lists ancient historical characters and scholars. He mentions philosophers, poets, scholars of medicine, orators, as Cicero, scholars of geometry, and in Baratella's Limbo we can read an amplified version of these lists, concluded by some lines where the poet lists no individual, but different categories: architects, scribes, merchants, shepherds, tailors, and so on. Going further, the whole structure and geography of the first part of Baratella's Hell is shaped following the model of Dante's Inferno. We find the lustful, the list of sinners is almost the same of the one we read in Inferno's Canto 5, Semiramis, Dido, Achilles, Paris. After the lustful, Baratella lists the gluttonous and the avaricious. And moreover, Baratella's hell is not flat, as the classical underworld, but it is set in a cavity, as locus inferior, costix elabiturata, he says at some point. So it is as Dante's Inferno. After the avaricious, Polymestor encounters the wrathful, as it happens in Dante's Inferno. And then he arrives to the gate of Dis. In order to reach the city, Yes, it's the right one. In order to reach the city, he needs to be transferred by boat, and as in Inferno 8, the nocchiero, the pilot, is Flegias, who, as in Dante, does not speak and is outraged for an unknown reason. We can find Flegias also in the Virgilian underworld, but his role as an infernal pilot is peculiar of the Commedia, as you know better than me. After entering the city of this, Baratella's underworld becomes rather confused and chaotic. However, we can point out some other similarities with Dante's Inferno. Immediately before naming Ulysses and Diomedes, Baratella mentions Eteocles and Polynices, the sons of Iocasta. The place where both the first and the second couple of sinners are located is described as a situs ignecoruscos, pulsating and shining as fire, and the two brothers are tremantes, vibrating, which is vaguely consistent with Inferno 26. What I want to point out, though, is the direct association between the Theban brothers and Eteocle and Polynices and Ulysses and Diomedes. In Dante's Commedia, Eteocles and Polynices are punished as traitors. However, asking Virgil about the fire that contains both Ulysses and Diomedes' souls, Dante makes a comparison with the pyre where Eteocles was put with his brother. I argue that Baratella derived this association of the two couples from the Commedia, although he clearly read this passage quite superficially, and perhaps without a proper understanding of its actual meaning, because Eteocles and Polynices are not punished in the same part of Dante's hell as Ulysses and Diomedes. They are with the traitors. And perhaps he didn't understand that the referring to Eteocle and Polynice was a simile used to describe the divided flame. At the very end of Baratella's Inferno, we can find the traitors. As in Dante, they are punished in a frozen lake. Please remember that the events narrated in the Polydores take place immediately after the destruction of Troy by the Greek army. Therefore, Baratella tries quite accurately to mention only characters from the classical mythology, with some exceptions or mistakes such as Hannibal, Crassus, Nero, Pyrrhus, Ezzelino da Romano, or Attila, but that's almost all. Describing the sinners in the frozen lake, Baratella wrote what you can read there. Lexicus ecce gelu comedit furibundus affile, cervicem pallore fremens, damnatus obillum, cumque tribus genitis cadit, atra morte, famescens. Ausecus irascens menalippo crudati deus, orafeo suadente vorat. And a few lines after, Lurida iam regis miseri vexilla patescut. This is a clear transposition of the scene of Ugolino as it is introduced by Dante at the end of Inferno 32, but instead of the names of Ugolino and Ranieri, Baratella used two fictional names, Lexicus and Affila. Affila was a name used in some moral poems, medieval moral poems. Baratella used the same comparison with Tideo and Menalippo too. We had already left him when I saw two frozen in one hole, so that one head was a hat to the other. And as bread is eaten by the starving, so the one above put his teeth to the other, there where the brain joins the nape. Not otherwise did Tydeus gnaw Menalippus' temples in his rage, than this one did to the skull. And then finally we find Vexilla regis produt inferni, the same rewriting of Venantius Fortunatus' hymn to the cross that we read in Inferno 33. And in a couple of pages, finally, the Polydores come to its end after 2,841 verses. At the end of every Baratella works, he composed a couple of verses stating the exact number of the verses that compose the work itself. As you have understood from the few examples that I briefly discussed this evening, Baratella was a dull and uninspired poet, relentlessly repeating the same images superficially borrowed from classical authors. He has neither a poetic imagination nor a deep understanding of classical poetry. In spite of his unstoppable urge to compose classically inspired verse. However, in defending the three crowns of Italian literature, he heralds Sicco's position, though banalized, thus showing that it was widely shared in the Paduan humanistic environment of the early 15th century. The pioneering researches and the genius of Dante, Petrarch, and Boccaccio were acknowledged as fundamental to set the foundation of the new age of humanism, que amat vehementer antiqua, who deeply loves antiquity. Although, as Sicco says at the end of Petrarch's life, quoting Cicero, nil simul et inventum et perfectum, nothing has been discovered and accomplished at the same time. And let me say that this position is perhaps essentially the same implicitly suggested by Salutatis in Bruni, by Coluccio Salutati in Bruni's Dialogi. Therefore, in this cultural environment, Baratella could not exclude a Dantean perspective in writing his messy catharsis. His public clearly had some idea of the commedia and highly valued Dante as a poet, so that ignoring him was not acceptable for a poet as Baratella, who desperately wanted to be acknowledged as a poet worthy of coronation. In the Venetian humanist environment of the early 15th century, if you wanted to be the new Petrarch, you had to read some Dante. Thank you.
Thank you. Rino, we should have plenty of time for questions.
Thanks for the wonderful lecture. Very clear and so interesting. And I'm so surprised that Dante is presented as the originator in the Canon. I think you said that he's the one who started to reawaken the muses in the context of, I mean, well, two questions, I guess. Are they so directly under the influence of the Florentines and Florentine humanism? Your talk seemed to suggest that. So that was one thing I was curious about, how much it's being driven by their reception of the Florentines. But on the other hand, am I right in thinking, I don't think the Florentines go that far in terms of celebrating Dante as the breakthrough author for humanism? What do you think?
As for the first, thank you for your questions. As about the first question, there was a continuous debate between Florence and Padua, and we can see it in Sicco's works, the letter to Nicoli, the letters from Bruni, two of them are preserved, to Sicco, where Bruni highly praised Sicco himself, and other letters to minor figures that lived for some years in Padua and then moved to Florence, and to whom Sico asked about stuff about Dante, Petrarch, and Boccaccio, when they were born, where they died, the exact titles of all the works, and so on. But I think that Baratella offers other proof of this constant dialogue, because he wrote a lot of poems also to Leonardo Bruni. Really a lot of poems to Leonardo Bruni about several issues, most of them praising it, but he demonstrated that there was a connection. And I think Sico had great respect of the Florentines, and also because he was well aware of their humanistic achievements. First of all, Nicoli discovers of Quintilian and other classical authors, but I think he did not feel inferior to them, less than them. He is very respectful, but as they usually are, these humanists, when they write to themselves, there are a lot of praising, you are a great orator, and you too, more you than me, and so on. But he is quite sure of his position, and I think that he actually had a better understanding of Petrarch intellectual figure, because he studied with a disciple of Petrarch, Giovanni Conversini, and he grew up in a city where Petrarch memory was really something very big and very important. Vergerio was his friend and wrote the most famous life of Petrarch, prepared edition of the Africa. There was still Lombardo della Seta living near Padua. So I think that Sico was well aware that he had a better understanding of what was Petrarch's role. And perhaps this is the reason why he's so vocal about Petrarch. And more vocal than Salutati, which always praised Dante, Petrarch, but yes, in a humble way, without trying not to irritate these younger and most brilliant fellow humanists. As for Dante, I think it goes the other way, that perhaps Bruni, mostly Bruni, helped Sico to focus on Dante and to better define the historical perspective of the development of the early stages of humanism. And that's the reason why he has to change his position from Mussato to Dante. And that, I think that's another proof that Sico's reconstruction of this environment is very smart and very deep, because he's Paduan. He has a great esteem of his city and of the value of his culture, but he is smart enough to understand how the things really are. That at the end Dante had a greater influence on Petrarch and then on the other generations, and was a more important poet, and is the only, and that's a fact, because Dante is the only author who is included in a history of Latin literature, exclusively for his poetical work. And I forgot
you think it reflects the reception of Dante and the vernacular literature in the Veneto, this particular angle?
I think so, but I'm not the best person to answer to this question in this room. I think there are other ones that can say it better than me. But yes, I think so that Dante was an important figure in the Veneto, and perhaps also Sico as Baratella. They are not probably accurate readers of the Commedia, but they are completely aware of its importance in the cultural debate. And they understand that they cannot write a history of literature without including Dante. That is not possible, because his influence is very, very, very deep.
Please.
So it's as far, if I understand the argument, the inclusion in the Florentine Vita lives of the three or just the two Italians. Also Boccaccio, or just
no? There are all the three of them. Yes, Boccaccio with a very short life, included only in the second version of the work.
So I guess I kind of have two questions. First of all, the title of your talk was about the canon, so I guess I wonder about the Latin canon. So these three come at the end, but how big how many other lives are there, and what exactly would the
Hundreds of them.
Hundreds of lives.
Yes, it's quite comprehensive. It's quite a complete history of Latin literature, minor figures and major figures.
My next question is there anything about, so it's the lives of, specifically obviously from the teacher's Latin authors, is there any acknowledgement in the text that these are not Latin writers? Is there any, that they're writing in the vernacular? I don't know in those passages, if we just scan very quickly, is there any sense that
No.
it says, I'm including these, but...
Alors, he knows, but there's some common knowledge that obviously he didn't know Greek literature. He didn't read Greek authors. He read some translation of Latin works, some early translation of Greek works into Latin, as some of Plutarch's life that were composed mostly in the Veneto region, the early Quattrocento, and the dialogi by Luciano, and something like that in translation in Latin. He knew that there was an Hebrew literature, yes, that there was historians who wrote but for the vernacular, the only acknowledgement is Dante. The only he says that Dante, yes, no, he says that also Boccaccio wrote other works in the vernacular, but they are and also for Petrarch. So the only three are this one, but. The fact is that for Petrarch and Boccaccio, Sico said that they wrote several Latin works that are really important and famous. And then they write also in the vernacular. And for Dante, the main reason of his inclusion is the vernacular. So the focus in Dante's life is on the vernacular poetry. Yes, he quotes also the Monarchia, but the focus is on the Commedia. And the image of Dante that Sico has is as the author of the Commedia.
That's fascinating. Can I just add one more? Unless you can tell the script of my question.
Can we ask you to please speak up a little bit and ask the questions there? I'm in trouble hearing.
Yeah, sure. You can, I guess the drift of my question is, I'm fascinated but testing the hypothesis that he really thinks that someone who writes in the vernacular is as good as Virgil. There was I wonder, there seemed to be up on the screen an acknowledgement in the Petrarch section that he's not as good as Virgil.
No, he's not as good as Virgil.
And so I guess I'm wondering how much of that language is in there, that we have some new Italians, but they're not as good.
No, but yes, the fact is that nil simul inventum et perfectum. Nothing has been discovered and accomplished at the same time. So they started a process. And they are the first one who actually tried to reconnect with antiquity and the literary values of antiquity, which are the real and important values of moral life and literary life. But yes, they are not as the ancient authors, and they achieve something similar to as for Dante and Petrarch, they achieve something similar to the ancient authors, only in poetry, because no one can parallel Cicero or Seneca for the prose. Thank you.
I was wondering, during this time frame, was Mussato's fame a regional phenomenon, or do we have like proof of a larger appreciation outside the Padua area, like in France or in Florence, for example?
The fact is that Boccaccio and Petrarch knew Mussato's work, and we have proved that they read them, and they read also works that now are lost. But and Salutati, outside the Paduan area, Salutati knew Mussato's works, but no, the fame of Mussato ends in also in the late Quattrocento, some of the most prominent humanists knew his names and perhaps was aware about the tragedy, the Cerinis, but that's all. Yes, his fame dies a few decades after him.
Maybe it's a silly question to ask, but can we read this representation of hell that Baratella is giving us as a kind of rewriting Dante in late inauguration?
No, I think it's too much, but because Baratella is such a flat poet that he has not the ability to do something like that, and that's not only in comparison with Dante, but also with Virgil, Ovid, and whatever. He has not a deep understanding of the structure, of the value, of the intention of all these works in order to really create new vital poetry from them. The interesting fact is that writing about Polymestor, the first book and the second book are, yes, versification of what is known from the classical sources, Virgil, mostly Virgil. But this third book is some kind of invention, and in adding something to Polydoro's story, he decided to make it with something from Dante, and that is interesting because I think he thought that his public would appreciate this correction, this addition, not correction. Sorry. Thank you.
How do we get from the idea that Dante is the follower of humanism to then the Vulgata, that Petrarch and Boccaccio are the co-founders of humanism, and Dante gets... Please follow my question? I mean,
yes, I understand, but there's a lot also of a modern debate, critical debate about that, so it's not an easy question. But I think that is Sico himself that put the issue in that way. They started to awaken the muse, but the model for the new humanistic intellectual is Petrarch, and so yes, he has yes, it has in the Scriptorio Illustre we can find the concept of pre-humanism, but also perhaps this long-lasting debate about why Petrarch and not the generation before Petrarch has to be considered the first humanistic generation. And the opinion of Sico is that yes, they started a process, but Petrarch is the one who changed the cultural perspective, who really changed the cultural perspective. But Sico has a deep sense of history, and so he understands that you have to begin something, and then slowly, in a long process, you will achieve some real results. And so, yes, he mentions the generation before, but yes, he also Sico thinks that Petrarch is the first real humanist.
One tiny thing, the comparison of Dante resurrecting Latin letters for the first time since Juvenal, I wonder why Juvenal? Is that to do with the shape of the lives? Is that the last life before the New Italians, or is it a comparison to Juvenal because he's a satirist in the comedians?
My mentor, Professor Banella, suggested that there could be a connection between the fact that Juvenal is the last ancient poet mentioned, and Dante the first one, and the reason could be this satiric approach. But yes, we cannot prove them. He's also a professor of Latin literature can perhaps would perhaps agree with Sico, no? Because yes, Juvenale is in the Aetas Argentea is one of the and you have to consider that he didn't know all the Flavian epic poets because they were discovered in these years, Valerius Flaccus, and the other one. No, I didn't remember.
Questions from the Zoom. Maybe we can take our questions offline and continue the discussion together more informally. But before we do, could you join me in thanking our speaker for a really fascinating talk? Thank you.